Dr. Boesak, welcome to ILIF. Teach us.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much, Dr. Wolf, for this opportunity to be with you today. It is one of those unexpected joys. I did not know when we were preparing to come to the United States for the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference and one or two other things that ILIF would slip in the middle of all of this. And I cannot tell you how grateful I am to be this year's lecturer linked to this amazing person, Vincent Harding. As I talked with some people, I was told, and I do remember that there were several attempts to get me here over the years, and I don't know why it never succeeded. But God has always some different ways and strange ways and different plans than ours, and I am so grateful that that can happen today. I am grateful to you, President Wolf, and to Dr. Hernandez for arranging this. I am deeply grateful to Lynette Lee, who initiated this, thinking that our time together in Indianapolis would pay off this time, and I'm so happy that that has happened. I'm also very grateful to Ms. Alicia Eno, who worked with our accommodations and our travel. She was very patient with me. We changed plans maybe 3 or 4 times, and every time she was right there, and I am deeply, deeply grateful to her. Thank you for that. To the Vincent Harding family who are here, where are you? Oh, thank you for being here today. It is really such a great honor to have you here today, and it's a wonderful, wonderful moment for me to do this. Vincent Harding came into my life and my work when I was still preparing my doctoral dissertation way back in 1974, 75, and 76 at the University of Kampen in the Netherlands. And I wrote that marvelous essay that he wrote in that book put together by Floyd Barber about the Black Christ. Those are the things that make an impression on you. Even when you are too stupid to really understand what he is saying, God gives us grace to grow into that understanding. And so I am so deeply grateful to that man and your father and your family member. So today's lecture is entitled, There is a River, Vincent Harding, Black Faith, and the Prophetic Imperative. It was the formidable Vincent Harding, in his groundbreaking work, There is a River, who, with the Exodus story and the history of the struggles of African American people as intertwined frameworks for understanding of all of these issues, who first explored these in terms of a river as a metaphor. Harding's work and thoughts have universal application. He speaks for all of us, still yearning for a freedom defined by ourselves, and knowing that there is still a river, perhaps many, to cross before we are finally done. In this ongoing metaphoric depiction of Black history, Black faith, and Black struggle toward freedom, there are, like ancient Israel's crossing of the Jordan, rivers Black people have to cross. And as one struggle ends, a new struggle begins. In South Africa and in the United States, the so-called post-apartheid and post-racial era present us with just such a moment. We are the river, Harding writes, and the river is more than us. It is driving us into the future. We are moving like a river towards our best possible evolution. We are moving like the river, he says, because if we resolutely claim agency of our own historic destiny, we can determine the course of that river. But at the same time, the river is more than us, because it will still flow after our generation is gone. It represents more than who we are, personally and collectively, at this particular point in time. It was there long before us, and it carries within its bosom the essence of our ancient selves, the dreams and the hopes, the failures and the amazing achievements of our ancestors, and the lessons that we have to learn from them, lest we lose sight of who we are and who we are meant to be, and we perish. It is more than us, and its waters will nourish the hopes and the visions of new generations, and the struggles for justice, dignity, and for possession of our own aspirations will be renewed, because they will have discovered other, perhaps neglected causes. But rivers can sometimes be formidable barriers. Think of Harding's discussion of Jordan's stormy banks in chapter 16, I think. And sometimes we reach those banks and we can see the land beyond, which is the land of our new becoming. When the 1960s began, I was 14 years old, in my third year of high school. It turned out to be a decade of tumult, of confusion, and of decision. The marches, the demonstrations, the strikes, the boycotts, the stayaways in the historic defiance campaign of the 1950s were culminating in the gigantic treason trial of the 1950s into the 1960s. On March 21, 1960, police armed with ammunition, live ammunition, broke up a peaceful demonstration against the hated pass laws at Sharpeville, south of Johannesburg. 69 dead, more than 180 wounded. In Cape Town, 2 days later, a march led by a young Philip Gosana was attacked by police in low-flying helicopters. More than 20 persons were left dead on that day. There was the rise of an emerging leader by the name of Nelson Mandela, who would be one of the initiators of the African National Congress decision to take up arms against the apartheid regime. And on December 16 of that same year, Mkontu the ANC's military wing, was formed. This decision would mark a moment of great tension within the movement and between Chief Albert Luthuli, its president, and Nelson Mandela, one of the chief architects of the youth movement in the ANC. There comes a time for any nation, Mandela declared from the dock at his trial, that one must either submit or fight. We chose to fight. Luthuli did not condemn his comrades for their decision. He understood and foresaw very well that the intransigence and hardness of heart of white people in South Africa could very well lead to such a moment. He too did not submit, but his fight was one of nonviolent militancy, as he called it, and he warned earnestly against us following our oppressors in what he called the vaingloriousness of violence. Luthuli would become the first African to be awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, and the debate about violence and non-violence in our struggle still rages on. And the generations following would remember Luthuli's words, "The road to freedom is via the cross." After Sharpeville, black political activism was severely persecuted by a fearful and vengeful regime. Thousands fled the country, many were imprisoned. What remained of black political activity was driven underground. The treason trial was followed by the famous Rivonia trial. Nelson Mandela, and 8 others were in the dock charged with terrorism. Across the ocean, the black civil rights struggle was reaching its zenith. In 1965, Malcolm X was assassinated. In December 1967, Chief Albert Luthuli died a suspicious death. 2 months after my ordination, on April 4, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was murdered. Our world was shaking. These were historic turning points. On the ecclesial front, it would be equally tumultuous. In the wake of the Sharpeville massacre, the World Council of Churches called together its member churches in South Africa at a place called Cottesloe, a suburb of Johannesburg, to determine the church's response to these events. The result was the Cottesloe Declaration, a cautious call for change in some respects of the apartheid policies. In 1968, the South African Council of Churches published the Message to the People of South Africa. It was a more theological document. It also critiqued apartheid and called its theological justification by the white Dutch Reformed churches a novel gospel. But both documents, authored by mostly white theologians and church leaders, had their merits. But to us it was clear. None of the 2 documents could speak of our black pain, our black desire for freedom, the black rage against injustice that we felt so deeply. The urgency of the black activism of the past decade was nowhere to be seen. And ultimately, the voice of those documents was a voice from white privilege and white solidarity, struggling to speak up against what was their protection and their profit. And those white voices felt guilty enough to recognize the injustices, but not outraged enough to completely dismantle the systems that produced them. And by then, the black voice of Albert Luthuli was banned, a black revolutionary voice was urgently needed, and the prophetic imperative had to be preserved. Still, the white minority regime reacted viciously to all of this, and the violence perpetrated upon that generation was relentless. All of this had great impact on this young preacher, but none so much as my encounter with Aunt Mariah Arendse. The year was 1968. I had just been ordained in Emmanuel Dutch Reformed Mission Church in Paarl, a picturesque, beautiful little town in the heart of the wine country in the Western Cape. At that time, the apartheid regime's Group Areas Act, an extension of the 1913 and the 1936 Land Acts, had reached our town. All who were classified non-white were now forcibly removed from their homes and their lands. The area was declared for whites only. Homes where people had lived for generations were taken, land was stolen, whole communities were destroyed and scattered to their new designated areas. Everything those communities represented, historically and culturally, was shattered. Their social cohesion was shredded. Our church would be bulldozed to make way for some white-owned supermarket. To this day, the devastation and the destruction remain traumatic for our people. And I was doing my rounds in the first few weeks as a young pastor, introducing myself, when I met Aunt Mariah, one of those strong women the black church cannot do without, and are so proud of. She welcomed me and she told me to sit down, but she did not really waste time with small talk. Reverend, she said to me, you do not have to tell me anything about Jesus, because I have known him much longer than you do. What I do want you to talk about, she said to me, is what is happening here. Our lands and our memories are being stolen, our homes destroyed, our communities broken up. I do not know what will become of my family and of our people. And this is done by white people who call themselves Christians. And I want to know what God is saying about this. And then she looked at me and she said, now on Sunday, she says, I want you to preach about this. I won't even try to tell you how that sermon was not what Aunt Mariah really needed. But it was for me an extraordinary revealing moment. And I learned some valuable lifelong lessons that day. First, it is not that Aunt Mariah rejected Jesus or thought that Jesus did not matter. I now understand better that she meant the Jesus she was taught about by the white missionaries who had been in her life all of her life. That blonde, blue-eyed European Jesus whose blood saved her soul, but who could not save her from this injustice. That Jesus who had blessed apartheid with his blood and sanctified it further with the blood of God's dark-skinned children. That Jesus had nothing to do with her pain and her suffering, could not rescue her from it, and was too meek and mild for the raw, robust, racist power of the white Christians. But at that stage, I myself did not know the Jesus she was seeking. It took me some years to say what I now know to be unquestionably true, and that has made a kind of a motto for my own life. If you say Jesus, I now know, you have to say justice. And if you say justice, you have to say Jesus. But the more you say Jesus, the more you have to say justice. And the more you say justice, the more you have to say Jesus, because without him, his love, his grace, and his empowering love, the struggle for justice will become too much for us. On that day, though, in 1968, I did not know how to say that. Second, she revealed to me the total inadequacy of my theological education. So those students of ILF who are here, thank God for what you're getting. Of course, I preached that Sunday, but I think my sermon fell hopelessly short. Nothing I had learned in those 5 years in seminary had prepared me for this confrontation with Aunt Mariah and the call for resistance that she issued to me. Those white Dutch Reformed missionaries sent by the white church to teach in our seminary, believers as they were in the theology of apartheid, in the supremacy of the white race, and in their own chosenness as God-elect people, had no intention of teaching us anything else, let alone ways of preaching hope and resistance to a people whose suffering they had caused and so handsomely profited from. We were fed an unbiblically spiritualized, otherworldly theology, completely disconnected from the realities of black pain, oppression, and the suffering caused by white racism. Later, our generation had begun to understand that we had to identify for ourselves and expose the fundamental and indispensable ideological power matrix that necessitated first an hierarchical, racist separation in society of the people and then also of the church. And so they created a church for the colonizer and a church for the colonized. The power, secondly, that we had to identify of a theology designed to justify, sanctify, and deify imperialist power, to protect at all costs white privilege, white impunity, white supremacy, white innocence, and white victimhood. So by design and with intense purpose, they created a theology for civilized masters and slave owners, and a theology for savages and slaves. A theology for black heathen, and a theology for white Christians. A theology of justification that canceled out a theology of justice. A theology of subjugation and enslavement that eliminated a theology of freedom. A theology of submission that rejected a theology of resistance. A theology of pietistic quietism that left no room for a theology of prophetic radical discipleship. But we should also not forget the ideological power of the theology of hymnology. We become what we sing. And so we were given a hymnified theology of otherworldliness that denied our people the voice to sing of holy this worldliness. The kind of theology that made us sing longingly of the golden streets of the New Jerusalem, while white people were stealing our gold from underneath our own soul, right from underneath our feet, right here in South Africa. And so they offered us a theology of imposed childishness, but never a theology of dignified personhood. So the question for us became, how would we hold on to our faith and serve the prophetic imperative? But by destroying that slave theology and creating another theology, that other theology of liberation and freedom and resistance, we rediscovered our freedom, rediscovered our childhood of God, reinvigorated our faith, and claimed the radical, prophetic, biblical tradition as our rightful heritage. But thirdly, that moment with Aunt Mariah taught me the necessity of preaching as activism. Preaching itself should be activist, I thought. Aunt Mariah was not asking me to go and lead a demonstration or to go and fight with the police or with the people who were handling those bulldozers that diminished or destroyed our houses. All that would come later. What she did expect from me was a word of comfort and protest, a word of hope and resistance, a word that would make her survive this horrific moment and help her face her terrifying future. It is an unwavering reason why black people come to church, to gather enough fire to take into the cold darkness of white hostility, white superiority and control, and what power that awaited us outside. It was true then as it is now. But what would come later was the understanding that for our faith to be real and preaching to be meaningful, the worship of God in the sanctuary must become the worship of God in the streets of revolt. But here are the origins of a young preacher turned activist. One conversation with a 70-year-old, not very educated, but infinitely wise woman would define the rest of my ministry. It would, to say it with Vincent Harding, determine the flow of my river. I thank God for the wisdom of our elders. But that moment was a moment of confrontation, of understanding, and of decision. It also made me understand that if there is a river, somewhere there is a fire. And between the river and the fire, there is scorched earth. In the Bible, we meet the fire as the presence of God promising liberation, as in Exodus chapter 3. Now, we have traditionally concentrated on the burning bush as the indistinguishable fire in the presence of God, producing that hallowed ground on which Moses cannot stand but on bare feet. That is almost a magical moment. I would suggest that we shift from the magic to something else. That instead we see that fire not as something miraculous and magical, but that we see the fire as the fire burning for justice in the heart of God, made visible for Moses to understand in that bush that was a fire. It is God's unrelenting hope that we, as God's children, will join God in God's struggle for our freedom and our dignity as God's children. It is a fire not even the power of the Pharaoh could extinguish. And the reason why the bush is not consumed is because God's desire for justice will not ever burn out. Now that turns a moment of magic into a moment of revelation. That is the fire that runs through the prophetic tradition of the Bible. Hence, the repeated identification of Yahweh with justice and liberation in the prophets, from Miriam to Hannah, to Mary, the mother of Jesus, and from Isaiah to Jeremiah, and from Amos to Micah. That Sabbath day in the synagogue in Nazareth, Jesus decides to read from Isaiah 61. It is a deliberate choice, and it is because of Isaiah's persistent ode to God as a God of justice in that section of his book. Beginning in chapter 51, over 10 consecutive chapters, Isaiah builds up this image of God in relentless, stunningly beautiful, and entirely convincing prose. And by the time we get to Isaiah 61, the prophet needs only 5 words to describe the character of God. I, the Lord, love justice. That is prophetic fire. And this is the fire God wants to see burning in the hearts of those fighting for justice. Martin Luther King Jr. understood it well when he spoke of the fire of the struggle as, quote, a fire that no water can put out. It is God's desire for justice that makes the struggle for justice and freedom holy ground. We also know the fire as punishment for a life of disobedience and dishonoring God and the other. In that image, God's self can be a consuming fire, as Hebrews 12:29 tells us. But there is also the image of the fire that will test the sort of work we have done on earth, as the Apostle Paul uses it in 1 Corinthians 3:13. And the prophet Jeremiah feels the God-induced urge of his calling to speak of the word of prophetic truth as a fire shut up in his bones, and I cannot hold it in. In the stories of ancient Israel's deliverance from slavery, the river Nile, simultaneously a source of life and a harborer of great danger, becomes the place where Miriam takes a stand and stands her ground, carrying upon her young shoulders the future of the liberation of her people. The river Jordan becomes more than a river. It is a moment of great consequence, a time for grave decisions, an ever-flowing challenge to cross over to a new, entirely different way of life in an entirely unknown place. For Israel in exile, in their suffering in a foreign land, and in their longing to return to their home, their tears flow stronger than the rivers of Babylon. But the Bible knows the river also as a source of the promise of hope and life, bringing equal joy to the heart of God and to the hearts of God's children. Superseding all other metaphorical expressions, it then becomes the river of joy. The first time the river is mentioned in the Bible, it is in Genesis chapter 2, embedded in the creation story. There, at first glance, it is mentioned only in its geographical space and in its functionality. A river flows out of Eden to water the garden, we read in Genesis 2, the verses 10 to 14. But already here, the river serves a deeper purpose. It becomes 4 rivers, and an indicator of the richness of the earth and of the prosperity of the nations in whose lands the river is directed to flow. The land of Havilah, according to Josephus and the Church Fathers, the Ganges Valley in India, or perhaps a section of the land of Abyssinia and the land of Cush, the land of Assyria. As the river Euphrates, last in the list of Genesis 2:14, it rises in what is today known as Turkey, flows southeast across Syria and Iraq to the Persian Gulf, all the lands known then as Mesopotamia. So right at the very beginning of creation, the river serves as a symbol of life, prosperity, and hope for all the nations known. And this hope-giving insight of the inclusivity of God's rich abundance will echo again in the very last book of the Bible. In Cape Town, we have the Kamisa River, now running visibly only underground. It is the place where the historical struggles for our land with the Christian invaders began in 1652. So I think Vincent Harding captures all of this superbly in There Is a River. However, between the fire as the presence of a liberator God whose heart burns for justice, and the river as an all-inclusive, life-giving promise of God, there is the scorched earth of enslavement and annihilation, of deadly disobedience and fatal unfaithfulness, of oppression of Israel by empires of every kind, and oppression of the poor and the destitute within Israel. There is a scorched earth of Israelites themselves who become robbers of land and the destroyers of dignity. The scorched earth of the pharaohs without and the pharaohs within. There will be false prophets and the corruption of the Torah, exploitation of the faith of the lowly and the murder of the innocents. There will be the temple who would be turned into a den of thieves. The poor would be trampled into the dust, their lives not worth a pair of sandals. The prophet would be rejected and killed, and Jesus would weep over Jerusalem. There would be a beheading and there would be a crucifixion, because the powerful cannot bear the truth spoken by the true prophets of God. That is scorched earth, in between the river and the fire. In our times across the world, in post-1994 South Africa, as in post-Obama, post-Trump America, post-Trump, there are the fires of harsh, merciless imperial rule, global, unrelenting, profit-driven, new liberal capitalist exploitation. There is the politics of vicious ethnocentric, sometimes religious nationalisms and Christian fascism that leaves no room for the flourishing of humanity. Homophobia, transphobia, bigotry of all kinds are hunting down God's LGBTQI children, crushing their human beingness, destroying their lives as if these do not matter. Mindless greed fueled by incomprehensible solipsism, self-centeredness, self-aggrandizement has literally set fire to the earth and an irreversible destruction of Mother Earth, causing the extinction of whole species on the earth, in the waters and in the skies, poisoning her rivers and oceans, incinerating the trees and withering the flowers. In an assault from hell, they rip from her bosom the most vulnerable of her children, leaving their emaciated bodies, like the bodies of Michael Brown and David McAtee, lying in a sun burning with an intensity we have not ever felt before. That is our scorched earth. And in the air-conditioned corporate boardrooms, where they jubilantly count the prophets and where they celebrate their political victories, they do not smell either the smoke or the stench, and neither do they see the hand writing on the wall. The mene, mene, tekel, upharsin will remain unintelligible, because among the willful, powerful, there is no Daniel left to tell them what it means. There is no Daniel, because they have killed the prophets, and those remaining they have silenced and banned from their midst and vilified into nothingness, as they did with Malcolm X and Oscar Romero, with Martin Luther King Jr. and with Jeremiah Wright too. To say it with that matchless poet from ancient Persia, Omar Khayyam, the moving finger writes, and having writ moves on. Nor all thy piety nor wit shall lure it back to cancel half a line, nor all thy tears wash out a word of it. So their feast of fools go on, and they do not see it. This is not merely a climate crisis. It is the lynching of creation, as it is the lynching of God's black children. And it is not just a political or a capitalist or a racial crisis, it is a God crisis. Writing his letter to the Romans, the Apostle Paul had no idea how right he would be proved. God's whole creation is now groaning in anguish, together with the children of the earth. Creation's labor pains, as he writes, are now the groaning of all humanity. Who would have thought that those groanings Paul heard would now be trapped in the throat of a black man, choking to death, whispering on behalf of all humanity, I can't breathe. But there are also the fires of global solidarity and resistance, burning bright in their multicultural, international, intergenerational, intersectional, and intergender gloriousness, standing their ground on the scorched earth, fighting their way through the dark toward the light, reaching for the living waters of the river of freedom and justice and equity and dignity. In 1963, James Baldwin published his Unsurpassed the Fire Next Time. And it contains that letter to his nephew titled Down at the Cross. And it is a superb and passionate piece of writing describing the times in which Baldwin lived. It makes of it a prophetic call for justice and courageous engagement for the sake of justice. He ends the letter with a reference to that old black spiritual, a plea, a prayer, and a warning all at once. God gave Noah the rainbow sign. No more water but the fire next time. So historically as a people and as a church, we are at a strange and unexpected and disconcerting place. In our time, James Baldwin's fire next time is now the fire this time. Ahead of us, real enough to believe in, but still too distant to see, are the living waters of the rivers of freedom. But in between is scorched earth. It is time for the prophetic imperative to be revived. At the end of the 1960s, activists in the United States helped inspire our own Steve Biko with their philosophy of black consciousness and their cry for black power. Guided by Biko's insight in which he said, the strongest ally of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. We set to work by reclaiming our own rightful mind in preparation for our struggle. We embraced what I have come to call the fivefold functionality of black consciousness as critical and self-critical, liberating, empowering, engaging, and humanizing consciousness. We embraced our blackness and we forged black solidarity by discarding the ethnic labels and divisions forced upon us by colonialism and apartheid, and by rejecting apartheid's pigmentocratic politics and racialized divide and rule tactics. We were done with being labeled Bantus or Indians or coloreds. Black consciousness meant revolt not only against what white supremacy expected, but also against what white supremacy needed. White supremacy needed our submissiveness, our inferiority, our compliance, and our complicity. And we refused. And it was the first phase of what I would later come to call the politics of refusal. Whereas the African National Congress proposed a, quote, non-racial, non-sexist democracy for a future South Africa, black consciousness had a deeper, more radical vision. It vowed to work for a non-racial, non-sexist, egalitarian democracy. For black consciousness, South Africa would become a democratic, socialist society which would be rooted in our understanding of African communalism. We saw no hope or future in new liberal capitalism at all. Like our comrades in the United States, we embraced the wisdom handed down to us from our forebears, Henry Highland Garnet, Frederick Douglass, Martin Luther King Jr., and also Albert Luthuli, when they told us power concedes nothing without a demand. And that understanding was foundational to the Soweto Revolution in 1976, a historic turning point, a time for decision. So in 1979, at the very first meeting of the South African Council of Churches after Soweto, black delegates argued for the church not just to support individuals who broke apartheid laws for the sake of justice, but to support and embrace radical acts of massive civil disobedience. We knew and we stood firm on theological and biblical grounds. So did I when I defended the Council's decision and actions in an open letter to the then Minister of Justice. So discovering the prophetic imperative, the politics of refusal, joined hands with what we came to call the theology of refusal. And joining the youth in the streets of protest, the church became a truly prophetic church. Not the institutional church that would always remain ambivalent about the revolution, but what Frank Chikane called the church of the streets. The time for pious words was over. When I called for the formation of the United Democratic Front in 1983, I did so not as a politician, but as an activist, pastor, and theologian. It was time for the theology of refusal to merge once again with the theology with the politics of refusal. And so we took up the mass struggles of the generation of the 1980s. We mobilized our people on a scale never seen before. We brought together an intergenerational movement that cut across the barriers of race and ethnicity and culture and religion. Based on Albert Lutuli's principles of militant nonviolence, the United Democratic Front became the largest movement in the history of the anti-apartheid struggle. And the church was in the forefront of it, not like we are today, hiding behind our pulpits while we praise God for not being able to participate anymore because we profit so much from what others have fought for. By the end of the decade, the back of official apartheid was broken, and in February 1990, Nelson Mandela walked out of jail. But let me quickly turn to some of the lessons we have learned along the way. First, we should begin perhaps with what Latin American theologian John Sobrino says. The first task of Christian liberation theology, he writes, is to try to attempt honesty toward reality. It is a difficult task, he says, because not only is our world characterized by institutions and systems of injustice and violence, it is also characterized by systems of concealment, of injustice and of violence. And this makes it extremely difficult for us to be honest about our reality. And I agree, because the forces of imperialism, oppression, and racism, patriarchy, white supremacy, and enslavement benefit from both the violence and the injustices as well as the concealment of these. And we must expose the politics of violence as well as the politics of concealment. Second, let us not be afraid to experience and show the prophetic rage that is so characteristic of the biblical prophets. They rage not only because of what they see around them, they rage because they see as God sees. It is the rage of Elijah before King Ahab, of Amos against the elites of Jerusalem, and of Jesus in the temple square. It is the holy rage of Miriam and of Ella Baker and of Winnie Mandela, of the prophet Micah and Martin Luther King Jr., of the prophet Jeremiah, and the rage of Miguel de la Torre and his badass theology. How is prophetic theology without rage possible after the lynching of Emmett Till, or George Floyd, and the list of others too long to mention? After Wounded Knee, the Elaine Massacre, the Sharpeville Massacre, and the Marikana Massacre. But third, we should be vehemently on guard against the looting of the linguistic arsenal of the poor and the oppressed. The ruling classes, the ruling classes appropriate the language of the struggling masses for themselves and for the establishment, and they put that in service of empire, in service of justice, not in service of justice, but of the justification and of appeasement, thereby rendering that language ineffective, if not totally meaningless. What in post-1994 South Africa is the meaning of the word freedom? And as defined by whom? Or what is reconciliation when it comes without remorse or repentance or conversion, without justice, reparation, or restitution, and therefore without healing? And after Nelson Mandela and Barack Obama, what remains of the true meaning of hope? With American mass media calling every centrist imperialist in American politics a progressive, completely gutting the term and the reality, when will prophetic black activists here and there, claiming the tradition of Vincent Harding, be ready to be called true revolutionaries? Who will let the world know the difference? Reclaiming the language of the oppressed as the linguistic arsenal of the poor and the destitute and the truly hopeful is the great task facing us today. Fourth, we can no longer ignore that we are living in an imperial world, and that the power of American empire is a power devastating, not just of the rest of the world, but of the poor, the oppressed, and the vulnerable in the United States itself. We cannot ignore the fact that the so-called new black church, completely swallowed up by the ideology of neoliberal capitalism, single-minded individualism and mindless consumerism, is at war with the traditions of the black prophetic church. It is a product of American imperialism. The harm it is doing to the church and to societies in Africa and elsewhere in the third world is indescribable. It is a new wave of new colonialism we are experiencing. American empire is fatal for the world, but especially for every oppressed person and person of color in this world. Fifth, as then, there is now a global revolution going on, and it is encompassing all calls for justice, equity, and freedom and dignity. It is engulfing the whole world, and we are in the midst of that revolution. The issues are undeniable. The challenges are unavoidable. The call is clear. Neutrality is no longer possible. Christians are called to join that struggle for freedom and dignity and humanity's wholeness. We must join not to Christianize the struggle, but as Albert Luthuli said, I will join the struggle, taking my Christianity with me in hopes that it will influence for the good the character of the resistance. Finally, we have learned the costly lesson that James Cone and Steve Biko before him has warned us about. A black face in office is no guarantee for justice, dignity, and equity for our people. Identity politics is the death of revolution. It is the grave of the sacrifices of our people over centuries. It is the wilted flower along the trail of tears, along the stony road we trod. It is still the sting of the chastening rod. It is not skin color or gender or sexual persuasion that makes the difference, we have learned. What makes the difference is the dedication and commitment to justice and dignity and equity, the courage to stand up against empire, and the courage to have respect for the sacrifices of the people. Throughout the years of struggle, we have been sustained by hope, but it is not what American social critic Chris Hedges calls the mania for hope, gripping so many of us. That mindless, unthinking, and blind optimism that disenables and paralyzes and disempowers us. I cling to the hope that African church father Augustine teaches us. And he speaks of hope as a mother with two daughters, and the one is called anger, and the other is called courage. Anger about the wrongs we see about us, and the courage to go out and do something about us. And that is an activist, transforming, subversive hope. It sustains the prophetic imperative. Today in my country, the fires of discontent are smoldering still, and it can light up any moment. The living waters of the river of freedom and dignity are still too distant. The scorched earth between is our burnt out hopes, our discarded ideals, our trampled upon dreams, our spat upon sacrifices. The stench we smell is the promises of our Constitution set alight by corruption and greed and criminal indifference. It is a smell of solidarity wounded by selfishness, of social cohesion immolated by racism, ethnocentricity, and narrow nationalisms. It is a smell of trust willingly offered, but now decaying on the ash heap of disdain and a failed reconciliation process. But we are not abandoned. There is a river. Sol Plaatje knew it when in 1916, 3 years into the devastation of the 1913 Land Act, and at the beginning of a new phase of resistance, wrote, "The one thing that stands between us and despair is that heaven has not yet abandoned us." We knew and believed it when, by the grace of God, we were setting new standards for Christian involvement in the Defiance campaign of the 1980s. We knew and believed it when our people were massacred at Sharpeville in 1960, again in Soweto and Cape Town and Port Elizabeth in 1976, and again in Langa Township in Uitenhage in 1985, when Archbishop Tutu and I buried 27 people at one funeral service, all massacred on the same day. We knew it through the years of protest and confrontation and slaughter throughout the 1980s, and we know it now and believe it now after the massacre at Maracana in 2012, not by a white regime this time, but by our own liberation movement, or the guns that shot those bullets in 1960, and the hands that held those guns in 1960 were white hands. The people who covered up that crime were white people. But in 2012, the hands that held the guns were black hands. Those bullets were fired by black fingers. The person who gave the orders was a black person, and the man who covered it up was a black man who now sits in the president's chair. That is scorched earth. But through it all, we believe that God has not abandoned us. All the neglect and the corruption and the kleptocracy, through the slaughter of our dreams and the ideals and the hopes for the future, are kept alive. And so we marched and we resisted, and today we still sing that song that we sang in the days of apartheid, Akana Mandla Usatani, which means the power of Satan is broken. There is a river whose living waters make glad the city of God, says Psalm 46, verse 4. The earths change, the mountains shake into the heart of the sea. Its waters roar and foam, the mountains tremble with its tumult. But there is a river, and that is the hope and the dream and the faith that makes and keeps us strong for the work of liberation and justice and dignity. I am about to go to my seat. But you know, when a black preacher says that, he's lying. But let me just offer this final thought. In the final chapter of the Apocalypse, John sees a river. The river of the waters of life, he says, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. That throne sits in the city of God, which is gladdened by the justice of God that is unstoppable, by the peace of God that is never ending, and by the undeniable dignity of God's people, which is anchored in the love of God. But John's vision does not end there. Here, John takes us back to its beginnings and to Genesis chapter 2. But in embracing that image, John totally flips it. In Genesis, we have seen the tree of life is planted in the garden into which the river flows. That is a sign of hopeful life, of courageous faith. It is a call to obedience. It also planted there, though, was the tree of good and evil. And that tree is a contradictory presence. It is an omen of things to come. The tree of good and evil becomes a source of a deep and terrible alienation from God, who is the real source of life. Its presence disrupts life in the garden. It ends in the banishment of the humans once so close to God. It culminates in a tragedy that would have no end. For only 2 chapters on, Cain would murder his brother Abel. And in becoming brotherless, Cain becomes godless. It is the story of the incomprehensible tragedy of human existence, the shattering power of human self-centeredness and self-destruction and alienation. It is the story of the dreadful beauty and fragility of human relationships. It is the Genesis creator story. The tree of life is mentioned no more. But here in the book of Revelation, John sees it again. On either side of the river, there is a tree of life, bearing fruit in full. Planted not in the garden, that Eden now tainted by disobedience and estrangement, by hatred and envy and the blood of the vulnerable. That Eden, once an exclusive garden, is now broken wide open, embracing God's whole world. Not in Eden as if kept for the joy of only a select few, but on either side of that life-giving water, there is a tree of life. So if, like the Nile, the river flows from south to north, people will come from south and north and west, and they will come from north and south and east, and on either side, they will find a tree of life. And that is not all. In John's vision, there is no mention of the tree of good and evil, Because John writes, nothing accursed will be found there. All the contradictions and the paradoxes have been overcome. The leaves of the tree, he says, are for the healing of the nations. Of the nations now. John radicalizes the image. The richness, the prosperousness, the joy of the river offers is no longer limited to those few nations only mentioned in Genesis. God's grace, God's generosity, God's embrace is for all the nations. Not a single one is excluded. Not a single one is left behind. Not a single one pushed to the margins. Not a single one shall hunger. Not a single one shall thirst, because they are all of them, God's precious children. And there is a river, and on either side is the tree of life, and the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nation. So here, in one single image, is the radical, indivisible justice of God, the radical, indivisible equality of God, the radical, indivisible inclusivity of God. We know behind us are the fires. Underneath our feet might still be scorched earth. But Vincent Harding was right. Before us, glittering like crystal, there is a river, and it flows from the throne of God. And for that reason, a black revolution, prophetic revolution, is necessary, driven by the prophetic imperative. And for that reason, we will not stop or look back or turn around. We shall march on. Thank you for your patience. God bless you.
Dr. Boesak, thank you so much for giving us the day of this moment where it has just been so full, and you can feel it in the room. We are grateful that you are here. I think we could take maybe 2 questions, but we have a reception outside, so we would like everybody to have an opportunity to greet the Boesaks. And so maybe 2 questions, and then so it helps us see what's being thought of in the room for a moment, and then we will adjourn for refreshment and time to mingle together. Is that okay with you?
That's fine.
Questions? Show of hands.
Right here in front.
We're advised at Lent to give something up, but also to take something on. What would you advise us to let go of today after hearing you? And what would you advise us to take up?
Well, if I may be so bold, speaking to Americans, I think one of the first things Americans should give up is the myth of your exceptionality. I cannot really describe the harm that is doing. And the situation we find ourselves in right at this very moment is because of that. When I heard President Biden, right at the beginning of his term as president, say the following: America is back to be at the head of the table, I shivered, because he does not see America as at the table. We want America at the table, but America wants to be at the head of the table. And if America cannot be at the head of the table, we smash the table. And so that is something that I think should be done. What you should embrace is the fact that, let me go back to 1985. I was given some award, I can't remember, I think it was from the Black Caucus, Congressional Caucus, and I couldn't come because I had just been released from prison and my passport had been revoked. So I sent a letter And I didn't know it at the time, but I was actually saying something that Martin Luther King had written about before. And I wrote a letter about the other American. Now, at that time, Reagan was on the throne here. And we had a huge fight with America's establishment. And so for many of my comrades and compatriots, like today, when you mention America, there is such a reaction, because America is an entity to be feared and to run away from, not ever to embrace as a friend or brothers and sisters. And I wrote that, and so I told them, I know that America exists, and I know what your president is doing, joining forces with our racist regime, but I know of another America. And that other America is what I appeal to. That is what you should embrace. And I would love to think that that other America is in this room today. I don't know what comes over you guys whenever you have to vote, that you always vote the wrong people into office, but that's a mystery for the ages, and perhaps an eschatological thing that we should discuss. But across the years, and I've always tried to let our people know this, across the years, I have come across Americans who were truly hideous in their attitudes, but I have come across Americans who were truly like brothers and sisters to us. You have strengthened my faith in times where I thought I could not believe anymore. That is the America I want, and that you have to embrace. So I will not say any more because I feel emotional at the moment, but that's what I would like to say.
Thank you for probably one of the most powerful presentations I've heard in a long time, if not the most powerful. So I appreciate that. I appreciate you and what you had to say. My question centers around now in South Africa. You know, you mentioned frequently about Stephen Biko and some of the other youth and the uprising and what happened in Soweto, et cetera. I'm curious to know, what is it like amongst the youth now in South Africa, post-apartheid? Is the fire still there? Are there revolutions? What is happening with the youth? And in particular, when you see how the youth went into the streets in 2020 after the death of George Floyd, are there any similarities there?
Well, at the moment, for the youth in South Africa is a very hostile place. Our young people today are as hopeless as I have seen them before 1976. We have a government that we have trusted. I have not ever personally known the African National Congress. They were banned when I was a kid of 14 years old. So I did not know the ANC. But there was a history of the ANC. It's the oldest liberation movement on the continent. It was presented to us as the movement who knew the heart of our people. There were amazing, illustrious names in the African National Congress, not just the Mandelas, but the Sisulus and the Mlangenis and all those people, and they were names that we revered. And so when we called for the United Democratic Front, one of the first things that we worked for was for the return of the exile, the unbanning of the ANC, the release of the political prisoners, and Mandela was number one amongst them. So our youth in the 1980s, like they did in 1976, gave everything. I mean, they stayed away from school, they stayed away from college, they stayed away from university because they were on the streets. And they said, we will sacrifice our hopes for ourselves and our future and our dreams and our aspirations for the struggle for freedom. And they did. I was in the midst of those kids. I was at so many funerals, almost every other week it seems to me now. I sat with their parents. And so I know what we had gone through. And I know that the main characteristic of our revolution then, and that made it so unique, was that it was driven and led by young people. And they gave up all of that, and they put their lives on the line, not for themselves, but because they wanted to leave a free South Africa behind for those who would come after them, and for those whom they loved who were still in exile, who had no idea what tear gas smelled like. And so they came home, the ANC. But the ANC that came home was not the ANC that was in our hearts. And so we are today confronted with an ANC government that has perpetrated the worst betrayal of our people that I have ever seen. They are corrupt. They steal the assets of the nation. They have made deals with the old apartheid capitalist class. Our president is the darling of the white capitalists at the moment. 6 white families control the economy of my whole country. Nothing comes to the benefit of our people. Unemployment in South Africa is now over 40%. Unemployment among the youth is over 60%. Youth in the rural areas, 70%. Those young people leave high school without any prospects. They have college degrees. They can't find a job. All they have is their anger and their disillusionment because the government does not care. Cyril Ramaphosa is one of the most incompetent and corrupt men. And I know the West think he's a hero. He might be your hero. He's not ours. But what disturbs me most about him is I think he's absolutely heartless. And so the anger and the disillusionment, you talk about the revolution, that fire is back. And we, in the 1980s, Dr. Wolf, we were spared the blood that everybody thought would overflow South Africa. I mean, in the 1980s, there was no political analyst or people who were thinking thoughtfully about our situation, who believed that we would get through that period without a bloody revolution. We got through that. And for 80%, our struggle remained a non-violent struggle, true to the wishes of Albert Luthuli. I have a feeling God has given us that mercy. I have a feeling that what we have done since 1994 was to turn around and throw that mercy and that grace back in God's face if we were not spitting in God's face. And that is coming to haunt us right now. So I am fearful of our people, of our country. I am fearful of our young people. The church does not have the voice of authority it had in the 1980s to keep our young people from setting fire to everything that they saw, because we have become so compromised. We have become so self-centered and self-satisfied. It is more important. I've written this in books, and church was not happy, or many in the church was not happy with me. But I said, look, we have become so mesmerized with Mandela that we've completely forgot the memory of Jesus. That's our problem. And so the young people today, when you talk about reconciliation, they get angry. I have begun conversations with young people where the opening sentence of one young man to me was, we know Nelson Mandela was a sellout. We know Tutu was a sellout. What are you coming to tell us today? Yeah. And I'll close now, but I will never forget. So at my age, I wanted to be retired. If not, sitting on my veranda looking at the sea and the mountains, and at least sitting on my veranda looking at the traffic. But that cannot happen, because wherever I go, People stop me in the street and say two things to me. Says, is this what we fought for? And the next thing they ask me is, when are you going to get the UDF together again? Because there is a fight that we have to fight. So that's not good for us. And I hope that we will have the wisdom and the grace of God once again to stop the country from going up in flames, but that's where we are right now. And so we need desperately to have some real change. That's why I keep on talking about freedom as defined by ourselves. Our freedom was defined for us by a small elitist group of black people who were making deals with the old establishment. Our freedom was defined by a media who did not care for us. Our freedom was defined by people from outside. Our freedom was never defined by ourselves. So pray for us as I will pray for you. We have it's actually quite amazing that God has given us at least the time to sit and see and understand and discern what is happening, so that we may be able to make the right decisions this time. And I want to be part of that group that makes the right decision again this time. Thank you.
Reception is ready for us in the hallway. Enjoy each other, have conversations with each other, and greet the Boesaks.